Today I'm going to show you how to disassemble a pretty common style of fork from SR Suntour. This particular model is the M3020, which is a little older model, but it's still more or less the same thing as an XCT or other low-end coil fork from SR Suntour. Usually the biggest difference is whether or not the fork has a lockout mechanism. This particular model does not have a lockout. The first thing you want to do is loosen up the 10mm nut on the bottom of the lowers. Don't remove this nut all the way, because we're going to use it to tap the assembly loose later. Next is to loosen up and remove the plastic caps at the top of the stanchions. There's a special tool, a spanner wrench, that's really worth using for this. You could always use a punch or a pair of tongue and groove pliers as a last resort, but that will damage the plastic fittings. I used a 3D printer to make the tool I'm using in this video. Links in the description below if you want to make one yourself. One cap is blank and is only used to keep moisture and dirt out. The other cap acts as a preload adjuster and will be a retention device for a spring that will want to pop out when you unthread it all the way. When you remove the cap, also remove the spring. It can be greasy, so use a rag if you can. Once the caps are removed, you can tap the nut on the bottom of the fork to break it loose from the assembly. I do this pretty often, so mine isn't really stuck in there, but if it's your first time taking it apart or it's really gummed up, tapping will really help you to take it apart. Once you feel the bolt is loosened up, remove the nut all the way off. Next, pull the fork assembly apart by working each stanchion leg a little bit at a time like this. Once the parts are separated, you will unscrew this nut and remove the plastic spacer as well as the two rubber spacers from this bolt. The bolt will then slide out the top of the fork lever and will have one more rubber spacer on it. Keep track of how the parts were oriented so you can put them back together the same way. Next, use a clean rag to wipe down the fork stanchions and look for any damage or excess wear. Any bent or kinked or heavily corroded parts are probably a sign that you should retire your fork. You can take a rag and push it down the stanchion tube with a wooden dowel to clean out the inside. The wood will protect the metal from being marred or scratched. Next, the lower portion of the fork. You'll want to remove the slider sleeves and the stanchion wipers. You can usually use your fingernails to pry the stanchion wipers off the slider sleeve retainer. A flathead screwdriver also helps out. Just be careful not to cut the rubber or the plastic parts with it. I'm leaving mine on though, so I can use it to help remove the slider sleeve. You can see that my slider sleeve comes out pretty easily. What I'm doing is rotating the slider sleeve about 90 degrees or so in either direction, and then it just slides right out. There's a retention slot in the lowers and a tab on the slider itself. Be very careful not to snap this slider tab or you will have to replace the slider sleeve. If you are having trouble getting the sleeve out, you can use a small flathead screwdriver to pry the tab up a little, and that usually helps to get it out. Once you have it out, clean it up with a rag and inspect the plastic as well as the rubber O-ring. This one is looking pretty worn out, and maybe next time I disassemble the fork, I might consider replacing them. You can get replacements for about $10 or so. I also pulled the stanchion wiper off the sleeve and clean it out really well with a rag. I like to use this silicone spray as a cleaner and a lubricator, and I really make sure to get all the dirt and old grease out. Once that's done, I use a silicone grease to lubricate the sleeve and wiper and put it all back together. The sleeve assembly needs to go in so that the retention tab locks into the retention slot. Give it a little pull to make sure it's in there solidly. Next, put the first bushing back on the rod, lube it up a little with silicone grease, and insert it back into the stanchion. Once it's in, put the spacers back on and tighten up the nut. I like to put a little bit of silicone grease on the stanchions before inserting the stanchions into the lowers. You'll need to get the rod to go through the hole on the dropout. If it doesn't line up right the first time, just move it around a little bit until it goes through. Put the nut back on and thread it by hand. Next, reinstall the spring and plastic preload retainer. This is going to be a little difficult as you have to compress the spring while you are trying to engage the threads. The trick I use is to remove the spring and find the point at which the threads start to engage. Then I use that as a reference once the spring is in there to more easily thread it in. Use your spanner tool to tighten the cap back on, and then when it's seated all the way, use a socket wrench to tighten up the dropout bolt one last time. Don't forget to install the other plastic cap, and then you're good to go. Hope this video can help some of you out, and remember, it gets easier every time.